And at times of year, special times like Passover, when our reading occurs, huge crowds of pilgrims would flock to Jerusalem to come to the temple. Now, naturally, these pilgrims wanted to make offerings to God. But for most of them, the money that they used in their daily lives was not allowed into the temple proper. It had on it an image, a picture of Caesar. Caesar, who had declared himself divine. This graven image might be something that people couldn't avoid in their everyday lives, but no good Jew would want to make an offering to God with a graven image on it. And to help alleviate this problem, they set up places where you could exchange your money. Not in the temple proper, but in the outer courtyards of the temple complex. Now, these pilgrims who had come from many, many miles away, had journeyed days, weeks to get there. Many of them could not bring animals for sacrifice with them. And so out there in the same courtyards with the money changers, you could purchase an animal to sacrifice as an offering to God. Now, admittedly, animal sacrifice sounds a bit odd to people in our day and time, but it was the norm in Jesus' day, not just in Judaism, but in most all religions. And I'm not sure that helping folks buy an animal for sacrifice is all that different from, say, buying a candle to light at the cathedral, or for that matter, from being able to buy a Christian book in a church bookstore. And is it all that different from money changing to allow worshipers to pay an offering with a credit card, or to have people's pledges drafted directly from their checking account, something we're looking into doing here at Boulevard? And so perhaps you can see how, for me, when I start to view things from this perspective and start to look at the cleansing of the temple this way, how as I do, Jesus morphs into Clint Eastwood and he looks at me with that steely glint and says, you can't serve God and mammon. Mammon being money. And I squirm a little bit. I squirm, but I don't for a moment worry that Jesus is going to chase me out of the sanctuary, or that Clint Eastwood is going to beat me up with an axe handle. Rather, I think that Jesus wants to use my squirming to drive me into a deeper and fuller relationship with God, to a deeper trust in God. You see, as a religious professional, one of the great dangers to my faith is the tendency to serve the church rather, or instead of, God and Jesus. And Jesus and Clint jar me just a little bit and make me take a hard look at myself and discover those places where my trust has been misplaced, where my loyalty has gotten out of kilter. I actually think the Ten Commandments work in a similar function that the commandments that we heard this morning. While the second part of them is concerned with pretty much run-of-the-mill morality, the focus of the commandment seems to be on the first part, on right relationship with God, on not seeking to manipulate God's blessings for personal gain, on making sure that all of life is properly oriented toward God. Now, I realize that most of you, with a few exceptions, most of you are not religious professionals. And so Clint Eastwood's preacher may not speak through that steely squint to you quite the same way that he does to me. But most all of us have those things that we serve or trust in rather than serving or trusting in God. And I've known more than a few church people whose loyalty to a particular congregation or to some group within that congregation seem to be considerably stronger than to Jesus' call to follow him. Now, don't get me wrong. I don't think Jesus thinks church is a bad idea. Clint Eastwood may, I don't know. But Jesus has called us to be the church. But he also knows that every now and then we need to remember what it means to be the church. We need to do a little cleansing of those things that have deflected us from loyalty to God and God's call to discipleship in Jesus Christ. We need to cleanse ourselves of those things that distract us from that temple that is destroyed and is raised 3 days later. You know, beautiful temples and sanctuaries are wonderful places. They can draw us closer to God. They can help us sense God's presence. They can give us some sense of the majesty, grandeur, and transcendence of God. But there is a more wonderful temple, a temple not made with hands. And he calls us to follow after him to true, full, and abundant life in relationship with God. Thanks be to God.